Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you, and it's good to be back. Actually, this is the third time that I've provided some perspective on the I-81 project to your group, so I'm amazed that that was the second time, even more amazed that you asked me to come on the third time.
Excuse me, I
yes.
don't know anybody who is as versed or willing to come than you, okay? If I could figure out somebody else that would come and say, this is the better, but you're willing to come, and that's a big power.
In this morning's PowerPoint presentation, my talk is really not a canned program. It's something I put together this morning, kind of a stream of consciousness, so it's a little, you know, less polished than maybe other occasions. You'll just have to bear with me, but I do like to bring, you know, whatever perspective that I've gained since the last time I thought about these things, to bear on things. So, this is I-81. Under the viaduct in the center of the city. I picked this up as a souvenir when I was on a tour of the infrastructure there with the Department of Transportation folks.
When did you pick that up?
A couple of years ago.
Okay.
So, you know.
What is
This is new.
Well,
Something that
this is not I-81.
I know.
But this is a tragedy that occurred over in Italy, Milan. The bridge in the middle of the city collapsed. We've got to be real about the fact that I-81, the viaduct, can't just be patched. It's got to be replaced with something. Whether we rebuild the viaduct or put a tunnel in, or whether or not we go with a community grid. And I'm going to be primarily focusing on that. We want to avoid any such situation as this. And our situation is not unique in the sense that the infrastructure throughout the United States with the interstates and so forth is now needing some massive infusion to replace or do something different than what was originally conceived. What's been going on? Well, we've had, for the last almost couple of years here, a DeFrancisco versus Cuomo struggle. And this is the larger political context in which the I-81 project is going on. But this is the race for governor that didn't happen. Whoops,
That was me.
I am jumping ahead here, I think. Ah, I am jumping ahead. I'm sorry. I missed a whole slide there that I need to do for context. All right. Let me start over again and pretend we didn't go to Milan temporarily. Will this story never end? And you know, you may be thinking this as well. I've been involved as a volunteer, a community leader for the last 5 years, and it's still counting. You know, I'm still looking out years, and I'm not getting any younger. And I'm thinking, and this is why I raised this bold. The viaduct, 2017, we are now approaching 2019 actually, was the date that the engineers said the viaduct was no longer useful in the way in which it had been constructed. Can we see an ending? Well, the ending, it's at least a penultimate ending, is in early 2019. The draft environmental impact statement, this is a very technical document. It's essentially the report by the DOT after they've reviewed all the alternatives. They've done design work, they've looked at the pros and cons, and we believe that in the draft environmental impact statement, I'll just call it the DEIS hereafter, there will be a recommendation. But they may be sneaky, and they may just lay out all the information and not make a recommendation because they'll say, we want all the final community input before we make a final recommendation. It remains to be seen how they're going to handle this, because of course, if they make a recommendation, then the sides we'll start mobilizing public opinion, either pro or con, or whatever the recommendation might be. So it remains to be seen how that will happen. We expect, before the DEIS is released, that there will be open house, okay? Which means that probably be at this, it'll probably be at the Civic Center, and there they will have display boards. There'll be a talk and so forth. We know that what the format's going to be because back in 2016, yes, that's 2 years ago, the DOT was ready to present the DIS with the choices down to 2 alternatives. One was rebuilding the viaduct or going with the narrower version of Almond Street as framed by the community grid. The tunnel was out of contention, right? The DOT had said, this is not practical for Syracuse. We're not going to pursue this, but we thought that shortly thereafter, there would be, we'll discuss that. And the thing that held up the DOT from, in the beginning of 2017, reporting out its DEIS, was the political wheeling and dealing here between Senator DeFrancisco, represents Syracuse, part of Syracuse area, and Cuomo. But this is the race for governor that didn't happen. Senator DeFrancisco orchestrated town officials, most state legislators, and Save 81 folks to promote a relook at the tunnel. It was a big forum that was held at Syracuse High School in December of 2016. So Andrew Cuomo comes into town January 2017 and makes the announcement at his State of the State message that, whoa, I guess maybe we better study the tunnel option, and we'll give that task to tunnel consultants who are the experts in this. In other words, he's bypassing the recommendations of his own DOT engineers and sending this charge to a group down in New York City. And essentially this diffuses the issue for Senator DeFrancisco, because he's been rattling the cage about the fact that the tunnel option alternative had not been given adequate consideration. So we're in limbo. The DOT project team is in limbo. But let me review the alternatives for you, and this will show you my bias. The community grid alternative that the state was ready to propose in October 2016 essentially returned Almond Street, which is the street underneath the viaduct, to the local grid. It would build new interchanges off of 690 at Krause and Irving, and it would make improvements to the interface between 690 and 481, which should be of interest to folks in Manlius and the eastern suburbs, particularly. Now, what I want to see is if this will take, no, it won't take me there. Well, I won't try to go there then. The second bullet in this list is the DOT's website, I-81 Opportunities. If you go to this website, I-81 Opportunities, you'll see in the lower right-hand corner a little box that says October 2016. All the materials, which is not really well publicized in the public domain, even though it's available in the public domain, lays out their thinking, which we believe, except for the tunnel, which they now have to be much more specific about, lays out what their thinking was in terms of choosing between options within the rebuild viaduct alternative and options within the community grid option or alternative, okay? So The community grid is the least costly, $1.3 billion. Rebuilding the viaduct, here's the problem. It's wider, it would be wider footprint for traffic safety reasons. They said the way it was designed originally just is no longer considered to be the best in terms of engineering, you know. And when I first came to Syracuse many years ago, that was described as Death Alley to me, you know, that interface between I-81 and 690, because of the way in which you swerve back and forth to get where you want to go. The viaduct would take out 24 buildings. So once again, we're destroying the heritage, if you will, and the existing businesses and so forth that are in that portion of the city. It'd be a little bit more costly, 1.5 billion. And then the tunnel, and we don't know, we've got, the tunnel study is available from a consultant, and the consultant made one recommendation out of several alternatives that they considered. We don't know, the DOT is not telling us which of the alternatives that the consultants deemed to be feasible, not necessarily recommended, but technically feasible, that they are going to bring forward with their analysis when they release the DEIS. It's important to understand that. I still have a hard time understanding what the rationale for the tunnel is, other than the fact that you speed through the center of the city. It's for the benefit of through traffic under the community grid would be redirected to what is now 481. And if people want to come back into the city, then connecting with 690 or going further north. It appears as though the tunnel benefits particularly Destiny, USA, and the businesses in the northern suburbs. And on the south side, Duncan Bright. Joe Bright, who's the son of Jim Bright, is now on the lecture circuit along with me, talking about how Duncan Bright as a furniture retailer is going to be significantly disadvantaged. I assured him that I personally have always gone to Duncan Bright first, but that didn't seem to sell him on changing his position. The tunnel will take 10 years as opposed to 3 or 5 years, 8 to 10 years. So, who's counting? 8 to 10 years. You know, I'll be in my 80s, right? If this was to emerge, as opposed to 3 or 5 years. So if you just think of the disruptive quality of this major reshuffling of all concrete and other elements of what that goes into having a highway, and the price is twice what the other two alternatives. The tunnel hybrid is really a myth. And the reason I say a myth is because the community grid, they've tried to sell the folks with a different perspective that the tunnel is really a hybrid and you would have a tunnel plus a community grid. What is not said is that there would be no improvements to I-690 and 481 because it's not necessary. You're not going to get the extra traffic out in the eastern suburbs. There would be no new interchanges at Krause and Irving, which is what the community grid would provide. And actually, since I don't have the specs in terms of the tunnel, I really don't know how people would now, under this alternative, reach the hill from any direction, east-west. So that remains to be seen. I actually believe that there would be massive congestion at certain traffic points with the tunnel. But because we don't have the information, it's a little hard to be specific about how that would flesh out. So what are the advantages of the community grid? One is the diffusion of traffic, right? It's not going to be a parking lot as many people have suggested. And that's primarily because the rhetoric is built around the community grid as a boulevard. I'm going to explain to you why this is not a boulevard in just a second. The other advantage of community grid is economic development with the freed up land in the center of the city. Mayor Ben Welch is now with his folks taking a look at how the city is going to reposition itself for the reclaiming of this land and how we're going to go forward with economic development. It really links the Hill and downtown and Southsides in new ways. And you know, you have to have imagination to do that. We are going to have a community forum in October, and I'll give you the date at the end of this, on economic opportunities with the community grid. So we see a win-win. One of the wins is expanding the tax base for the city. So now this is dead space. There's no utility in terms of benefiting the city, and we all know the city is in dire straits in terms of being able to pay for all the things that the city needs. The community grid will be the least disruptive, and it will continue to generate growth that we just can't necessarily anticipate. And here's one thing that certainly people can disagree about, but urban density is the wave of the future. What the city's now structured in such a way that we've compromised ourselves as an urban area, and the more parking you see, the more suburbanization you have to think in terms of the city. And cities aren't designed to do that. You can want the city to be a suburb with all the parking and easy access and things like that, but it's really contraindicated toward the whole model of what urban density is all about and the benefits of that. Now, here's explaining what the two alternatives to the community grid. This was October 2016. This is language taken directly from the DOT. Community Grid 1 would have made Almond Street into a boulevard. It would have been a feeder that would come directly off of 690, and it would be the north-south thoroughfare through the center of the city. 3 lanes, at least 3 lanes, north and south, and there would probably be an additional lane for turning and so forth and so on. They opted not to do that. What they opted to do was to make the community grid alternative that they were presenting is Almond Street 2 lanes, north and south, with the turn lanes where it was appropriate. But here's what the difference is. The traffic that would be coming off the interstates would no longer, as it does now, with Almond Street kind of being the way in which traffic empties off of 690, 81, but there would be new interchanges at Cross and Irwin. And they're not there now, so it's hard for people to imagine what that would look like. But if you were coming from Manlius and you got on 481 and then took that to 690, you might get off at the new redone Teal Avenue exit, but most likely, if you were going to the Hill, you would now get off at the new Krause Avenue interchange, which is not there now. It will be, and if you're coming from the west, then you probably get off at the Irving interchange. Yes?
Well, but Cross and Irving are so narrow, even if there's an interchange there's so much traffic there now. How much more traffic can you get?
They're going to make the street improvements that will enable traffic flow to be able to cope with all that.
I find that very difficult to believe. I mean, there's a road, a sidewalk, a little bit of grass and buildings.
Yeah.
No buildings.
That's it.
Yeah.
Well, you've got I don't know about what you mean by new buildings. There's an awful lot of buildings that are close to the sidewalk there.
Right, right. Well, and the important point, though, is to not think about Krause and Irving, is either of them bearing all the burden that the ramps off of 81 South, that people, if you chose not to get off at Teal Avenue or Townsend, and then came around to get off at Adams Street to go up to the hill, for instance, there was a tremendous amount of congestion at that point because you have people coming from all 4 different directions trying to jam into that particular nexus. So, I'm not an engineer. I can't tell you what the traffic flow models would look like, but this just paints a different picture than I think many people have in terms of what the community grid is all about. It is not a boulevard. It is a model of diffusing the traffic.
But even coming down across Irving at 5 o'clock is a nightmare. And I don't know how making an exchange at the bottom would make any difference. Just getting close to the 690 is almost impossible at 5 o'clock.
Under the current way in which the traffic is designed, right? Yep. Sorry, I can't get
narrow
any-
streets.
Yeah, well, narrow streets can be widened. What can they say?
Oh, I would question that.
Well, you know, it happens all the time, so.
You have to move an awful lot of huge buildings there.
Yeah, well, I don't, once again, I don't have the details on that. Did you have a question?
Yes. Hypothetically, let's say that the grid goes through.
Yep.
What happens to all the federal dollars maintaining the expressways? Does that go into the city at that point to maintain the streets? Because right now, as it stands, the city can barely eke out 1 mile of repaired road out of all the hundreds of miles that they have to deal with a year. By that time, by the time they finish repaving any of the roads in the city of Syracuse at that rate, it's going to be a wasteland.
Well, I understand your perspective. I think the city will assume responsibility for road maintenance as it does now within the city. I think there's been other efforts. The county of Onondaga has shared its resources with the city. I think there's a number of things that will have to be in place in terms of maintaining the street grid. The interstates, and which includes the state highway that'll lead up to what has been the old I-81, and the old I-81 north of downtown will continue to be the responsibility of the state. So the city's not picking up any responsibilities in that area.
Peter, but won't they have to pick up the maintenance adjacent to the I-81, the new I-81?
Oh, there will,
Cutting the grass,
there would
picking up
be
the
some
junk?
changes in terms of who would be responsible for what, but that's not a question that I can really answer. I'm just trying to lay out what the particulars are as I understand it. And it's not even clear that the state will give the land back that is in the Almond Street area now, because the state owns that corridor. So there's a number of technical and political questions that we've got to continue to deal with. Yes?
You mentioned that there would be new property to add to the tax base in the city.
Yes.
But how can they keep that property from getting gobbled up by the hospitals and the university and other non-taxables?
That is also part of what I would call the political questions involved with this. I just had my cousin visiting this past weekend from Providence, Rhode Island. They took out an interstate in the center of the city there, and what happened was that a commission was created to work up the particulars of how to redevelop that particular area. And I know this is what has been done over in Rochester. Now, Rochester was not a state project. They filled in some depressed highways there that were part of the system, and they set up a commission of folks who explored the various alternatives and found development that would be generating profits. I was also surprised, I had this discussion with folks, when you think of not-for-profit corporations creating housing, you think, well, they're not going to pay taxes, and that's not true. Not-for-profit housing corporations do pay taxes and to the tax base of the community. Yes, sir.
To your knowledge, has there been any comparison to what Philadelphia faced 30 years ago when they were coming? You come off into the Schuylkill Expressway into Center City, Philadelphia. Now, what they did is they didn't build a tunnel. They made a depressed highway with streets going across periodically and with ramps periodically to get two important things. Purpose being to go to the bridge to New Jersey. Certainly a lot cheaper to build a depressed highway than a tunnel, but what you do is you get the traffic away. To your knowledge, was this ever looked at?
Oh, absolutely. The
And
depressed highways,
discarded?
a number of alternatives early on were considered, and those were part of the 15 or 16 alternatives that the DOT was still considering up until October 2016, and they were all relegated to, choices that weren't going to be pursued.
This was not feasible or too expensive?
I don't remember the technical details on why they ruled that out, but all that information is available on the DOT website if you want to explore. And people continue to ask the question about the depressed highway. So let me move on. I'm also not clear about what time it is. Oh, there's the clock. Okay. When we're thinking about an alternative, part of the larger context that we need to consider about what the transportation needs of folks are, and our persistence of living in automobile culture, things are changing, which is going to reduce. We're not going to see an increase in traffic. We're just not going to see it. The population has not been growing. So unless everybody buys 2 or 3 cars and all the families are driving all at once, we're just not going to see that, and it's not going to have, in that sense, impact in the city. What we are going to see is an increase in ride-sharing businesses, Lyft and Uber. We're going to see driverless cars. Think about what the potential of that is. If we have a tunnel or a viaduct, is that still going to make sense? On the public transit side, we're anticipating that bus rapid transit, as is now found in Albany, Schenectady, Capital District, bus rapid transit will emerge as an alternative. They're kind of stuck now. They've got a proposal from the Syracuse Metropolitan Transportation Council.
Can you describe what that is?
The bus rapid transit? It essentially identifies major corridors where there will be a limited number of stops, and the bus drivers will have the ability to essentially run through the red lights, because they'll change a red light to a green light. And there will be accommodations so that there will be built-in incentives for people to gather at those limited number of bus nodes. So, which means that if you're going on the local bus, now say between Eastwood and OCC, I don't know how many stops you would make to try to get there. It'd probably take you an hour, right? Now, I'm not saying what the time would be, but let's say we cut that in half. Now, we've saved all the people that are using bus rapid transit in that particular corridor an hour a day out of their lives, right? So this is an innovation, as I said, that's happening throughout the United States, but also in New York State, bus rapid transit.
I'll throw it away.
You can sit on it,
He's
yes.
exempt from the rule.
You know, we're essentially all senior citizens here, and one of the things I become aware is that young people don't think like we do. You know, I try to avoid using my car when I don't need to. I live in the Westcott area. I can walk over to the Westcott business area, but sometimes it's cold or it's lazy, and, you know. So I go what, a quarter of a mile, which is crazy. Young people want safe streets to walk and bike. There are more and more bikers, and you say, well, biking's not practical. In Syracuse, you go to Ottawa, you go to Toronto, you will see massive infrastructure for biking. So this is going to happen. And the other positive development that's occurring that will take burden off of low-income people having to get cars and add to them is that we now have a system emerging for low-income people to use shuttles, because the bus system doesn't work for low-income people who are living in the city to get out where the jobs are in the suburbs. It's a crazy world we live in, but these things are emerging that will help. So what's the latest developments? I think on the Southside National Action Network, there's been some mixed feelings with the folks on the South Side about whether or not they're going to support the community grid, but it's becoming more and more clear that that is also the alternative that's preferred, folks. There's a prominent group of hotel folks on 7th North Street or in that area at, what's the other cross street? Anyway, they've been some of the leading lights, but between Save 81. They have now conceded the fact that they will have successful hotel businesses, whether or not the I-81 continues to go. Even Senator DeFrancisco has conceded the fact that the powers that be have always wanted the community grid, and he's expecting that that's what's going to happen. Pick it up in the New York Times interview with him. Key to, I think, shaping public opinion has been that the Post Standard has endorsed community grid, and that's been followed up recently, and we're expecting other organizations to do likewise. Gifford Foundation, which incorporates a number of business leaders, for instance, and St. Joseph's Hospital, their trustees have said, we're with the community grid. I think that's very significant, because one of the myths that has been perpetuated by the Save 81 folks is that, oh my God, somebody's going to die because 81 isn't there to take them immediately to upstate or any one of the hospitals. It's folks who are running the business of healthcare in an acute sense, I think, have just put that myth to bed in terms of the fact that ambulance services don't use the interstates except to gain access to the city. Then they access the street grids, because the traffic patterns up on the interstates are so unreliable in terms of them being able to get through to where they need to go. You have a question, sir?
What position has SU, Krause Hospital, and Upstate Hospital taken?
Well, Upstate is a state institution. You're not going to get the leadership there to say we support the community grid. But trust me, because I've had the conversation with the president of Upstate, they are pro community grid. And if for no other reason than they want the least disruption, because they're right adjacent to the whole situation there. They want the least disruption for all the fine stuff that's going on in terms of surgery or whatever else they're involved with. Krause is part of the Hill Corporation. Formally, the Hill Corporation, which includes the hospitals and the university, have endorsed all the principles essentially of the community grid, but they don't want to say so, because these are That's my problem. I'm just gonna ignore that, sorry. But the principles that they've outlined that they want to see in the alternative match up point by point with the community grid.
Peter,
SU particularly.
That mic turned on, no, the microphone next on the lectern. Is that mic turned on?
Is that mic turned on? Yeah, I'm just not speaking into it very clearly. Can everybody hear me?
No.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I will be closer then. Where were we? Yes.
What about SU?
In the final solution, who has the most power to make the decision? I mean, they've been asking so
Yeah.
much of public opinion.
Try
I'm not
Andy
sure,
Yeah.
does that even hold?
Yeah.
Is it gonna have any weight in the
Well,
end?
we'll get to that in just a few minutes. There was a question here.
Yeah, what about that, high-speed transportation in the area north-south? Instead of just buses going north-south along the highway, would that be a possibility? Like BART or something of that sort?
Yeah, I don't know. Light rail has been considered as an alternative actually to bus rapid transit, but you can't hear me now?
Take the mic off the stand.
Yeah, take the mic off the stand and hold it closer to you. There you go.
Is that better now?
Yeah.
Okay. And the question about SU. SU is, it reflects a lot of different interests. You know, if you're a guy that, or gal that wants to go to the Dome for a football game or a basketball game, your focus is pretty narrow. But it's clear from conversations with multiple leaders at SU that they want less emphasis on cars. They don't want more cars on the hill. They want to find alternatives to that approach. And to the extent that the community grid is linked with that whole notion of less reliance on finding parking for all the people that want to go to the university, then that makes sense for them. Joni Mahoney recently was reported as whispering in the ear of the governor about the tunnel. I'm mystified by this, but you know, it's one of the things that reminds me in this whole process that regardless of what I think the outcome is going to be, it's still a contentious environment where we need to. Now, I wish I could play this, but I think there is a very fine short video, 2-minute video, that's connected to the editorial that was in the Post Standard supporting their view that the community grid was the best. Maybe, although it doesn't reflect it any time. Anyway, so earlier I think there was a notion. Well, you've got your opinion, I've got my opinion. I'm aware that confirmation bias is something that we all need to deal with in this era of false news accusations. You know, we are looking for the best facts that we can find. On the other hand, our presuppositions bias us to confirm information favorable to our preconceived notions of what our self-interest is. I remind myself of that all the time. I just lift that up to you, that I hope you're open to the kind of information that I've been giving you, which is, I'm sure biased to some degree because I choose the facts to present to you, but it's done in goodwill without any particular self-interest that I can identify in myself, other than having a quality of living in the city that reflects the kind of community I want to live in. So I'm wondering at this point if I can just see what the sentiment is here in terms of whether or not folks have landed on one alternative as being, what's in your mind the best alternatives. So let me see the hands first of people who are still undecided as to what the best is. Okay, so that's a very small minority. Can I see the hands of folks who believe that the viaduct should be rebuilt? Okay, well, I've been saving, and can I see the hands of folks who would favor community grid being done? Thank you. Okay, well, if we were all voting, and you were the judge and jury kind of thing, it looks like that would win out.
Peter,
Yes.
let me add a couple of little loose nonsense, crazy things. Think about how your decision of what you want will impact you. I know how it will impact me, I know how it will impact Mel, I know how it will impact Anita, I know how it will impact people who want to go to the Dome that are coming from Tully, and I know how it's going to impact people who want to go to the Dome that are coming from North Syracuse. Figure it out. Where are they going to get off? Right now, they get off right down on Adams Street and go. Takes a couple of minutes, takes 10 minutes, but they factor that into their transportation. While I was doing this, 81, I met up with a man by the name of Steve Irwin, who's here today, and he presented a case around the 81. It has to do with money. And no matter how you run this world apart, it's all about money. A friend of mine, I said to a friend of mine, who was a street guy, gambler guy, I said, the secret word for today is prudence. He says, you idiot, the secret word for today is cash. And that's what it's about. This is all about money. You get dig, Peter, and I understand the community grid, and I can more for it than not. That's just me. But it's all about cash. And Steve, you want to come up and say, you don't mind?
Oh, no.
He's going to tell you his understanding, and tell him who you are, and who you're with, and all that other Michigan.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
So my name is Steve Irwin. I'm the Regional Vice Chair for the Trucking Association of New York. So I would probably be labeled as one of the narrow-minded people, I guess. I'm also the Transportation Manager for Clinton Stitch Cooperative in Cicero, New York, which is the Pepsi bottling plant in Cicero. I've been in the trucking business 41 years, going on 42. It's been my life. Nothing that we use, nothing that we wear, nothing that we eat is not moved by a truck. Like them or dislike them, it does not matter, one way or the other. Everything you touch every day, somehow or another, at one point in time, was on a truck. There's been a lot of talk about moving more trucks on rail, which you'll see all the time. If you're anywhere near the railroad tracks, the trains going by with tons and tons of tractor trailers on them. Well, they don't magically appear on them trains. A truck took it from someplace to the train and picked it up from the train and brought it back. So, while my vision may be somewhat narrow because I'm in the trucking world, everything that we do in the trucking world on a daily basis affects everybody, because the cost of transportation has a huge impact on our daily lives, because again, everything in our lives at one time or another moves by a truck. A couple of points. First of all, the safest place for trucks is on the interstate. It's where they belong. It's kind of why the interstates were designed in the first place, was to get trucks off of the old Route 20s and Route 5s and all that stuff and put them on interstates where they belong. If you remember, a few years back, the towns of Skinny Atlas and Marcellus and all those people battled long and hard to ban they wanted to ban trucks. And unfortunately, that was an ugly situation. That was trash trucks that were coming up from New York, going to Seneca landfill, and they were taking the shortest route, which was through those areas. So trucks belong on the interstate. A lot of the argument for the grid has been that it really only adds 3 minutes time, I think is what was said, for vehicles going north on 81, which I would have to agree with for the most part. If you're going from Nedrow to Cicero, a community grid, if you take 481, does not add barely any mileage, and it does not add barely any time to that route. I will tell you that 481 is undersized to handle the extra traffic, and right now the only plan by the DOT is to widen it to 3 lanes from the DeWitt interchange to 81 south of the city. There's no plans to do anything from DeWitt north, which is a travesty, because if you travel that route during rush hour traffic, that highway is always extremely congested. The other thing I will tell you, I've got to put my glasses on.
Oh, glasses.
So there is a vast number of businesses, not just trucking companies, but businesses on the west end of the city that will be negatively impacted by a community grid. Anheuser-Busch, United Auto Supply, Lowe's Home Improvement, G&C Foods, Cisco Foods, McLean Northeast Foods, FedEx, Roselli Asphalt, A. Dewey Pile, which is a trucking company, Gypsum Express, which is a trucking company, Old Dominion Freight Lines, River Valley Frozen Foods. Those are just a few of the companies that are located on the west end of the city.
Hold on a second. Don't just take that one truck that's gonna get that extra 3 or 5 miles every day added onto it, but extrapolate it. I hope you all know what extrapolate means. You take that number of 3 and multiply it by the number of trucks, and you add to the miles, the cost per mile to go from point A to point B, now via the community grids, and you're talking about money. My brother would say, it's money, Louis. I understand. And that's what Steve was trying to say here, right? Do I have it pretty?
Yeah, well, actually, I do have
Oh, okay.
a little
Okay.
things to that. So, also, one of the largest petroleum tank farms is located west of the city, Ted Park, just outside of Van Buren and Warner's. There's 7 fuel companies that haul out of Ted Park and go south of the city. Currently, they do Route 690 to 81 south and down. So to go from Ted Park to Nedrow is 18 miles and takes 31 minutes. Costs them $42 one way. Having to go 690 all the way to 481 and then down to Nedrow is 35.8 miles and takes 43 minutes. At a cost of about $53, so about an $11 increase. Now, Turpinning alone, just Turpinning Trucking alone, has 12 trucks a day that do that run, and that's just one way. So for them, that's an annual added increase of just under $100,000. It would raise. It also, what it does is any gas stations south of the city bumps them up in the freight category. It's going to cost 3 cents a gallon, roughly 3 cents a gallon in extra because of the added freight. So it has a reaching thing. And I want to be clear, I'm not opposed. I understand a lot of the drive for a community grid. I do understand a lot of that, and there's a lot of the community grid that to some degree makes sense. What I don't understand is some of the things that get said. I went to a meeting at the Syracuse City Common Council, I think it was in June, and all I heard was that this was going to revitalize the city because it was going to create a ton of new tax base. Well, and I, to this day, still don't know where they're ending 81 and starting the community grid. Everybody you ask has, do you actually know that? Where does it end, coming south? Because everybody has a different opinion.
I think it's gonna end at Brighton Avenue, right there.
No, it'll be at Martin Luther King East Drive,
Which is the old Castle Street.
yeah, which is the old Castle Street.
But how about coming down from the north?
Oh, coming down from the north at 690.
It ends at 690, okay. So,
You mean you'd be required coming down 81 to get off at, if you wanna get off, you'd have to get off at Salina, that one, or Clinton, or go up, go
Well,
on
that,
690.
there's going
some
to be.
kind of reconfigure.
It's Oswego Boulevard is going to be the new, point at which vehicles will come off of I-81 going south.
Oswego Boulevard is over there, it starts over there by Destiny and continues down there by Spencer Street, am I right?
Think of it right at downtown.
Okay.
Think of it much further south. It'll enter into Erie Boulevard, it must be Erie Boulevard.
Okay.
And excuse me, and I think that's one of the problems that we're discussing here right now, where it's gonna end and where it's gonna be getting, and how that traffic is gonna work, so we get a clearer idea of what it's gonna be like. I think the people, or the engineers, or the advocates have not made it clear to us, the people that are gonna be using it, of what's gonna be.
Well, it is on the DOT website, much of the data. It's, because there's a lot of technical details, it's difficult to explain that all to the public in a way that people can digest it. I mean, I keep looking at it and going, oh, all right, well, I've got to fine tune that in my own brain in terms of what that actually means. And if you don't know where Oswego Boulevard is, I mean, there's 2 blocks left of it. It used to be the main road that went north out of downtown, but that's, Oswego Boulevard becomes Montgomery Street. So if you think of that connection there. But folks coming from the north that want to go to the hill, they would get off at Irving. So they wouldn't go downtown. They take 690 to the new Irving exit and shoot up the hill or go wherever they need to go.
But they would still have to shoot up that Adams Street Hill, and that's a pain in the neck.
No.
They're going up.
Oh, Irving is,
North,
south,
south,
right,
yeah.
not Adams is east. Okay, I got it.
Do you anticipate the inland port, if it comes here, being negatively affected by the community grid?
Well, I'm not sure where they're talking about. It seems like every time they talk about the inland port, they talk about putting it
Well,
someplace
it's
different.
not far from 481.
Now,
Yeah.
they've made a decision to expand
The
east
rail.
east
Yeah.
Syracuse
that's where
Railroad.
they're gonna go.
I don't see that as being affected at all by whatever's done with 81, because anything going there theoretically out of the south is gonna go up 481 no matter what anyway. So that, I don't see any negative effect on that.
Are you done with your presentation? Because I'd like to hear more. Are you done with it?
Well, I just had 2 other points I just
Yeah.
wanted to make.
Yeah, I would
Mary
like-
Ann is
I
my
would-
spokesperson.
I would
Okay.
like to hear them.
Okay, so one of the things that I heard at the Syracuse Common Council chambers was this was gonna revitalize the city because of all the new tax base it was gonna create by getting rid of 81. So I've been looking and looking and looking at maps, trying to figure out where does all this property come from? Because a street, even if it's 2 lanes, it's gotta be, in my opinion, a minimum of 2 lanes each direction, is not gonna take up much more room than the current. I'm not talking about a new viaduct, I'm talking the current 81 takes. You'll probably lose a ramp or 2, but you're also gonna be creating new ramps someplace else for Irving Ave and the other streets. And the other question, or the other thing I heard was the quality of life, and I would not disagree with that whatsoever. I don't. I'm sure that's not a great place to live next to. But I would ask, why is the quality of life on the side of 81 any different than the quality of life on Route 690, which was, we just spent millions replacing one Teal Ave bridge, they're spending millions doing the other one. Why didn't we take 690 down? If the quality of life along an interstate is that negatively affected by an interstate, why didn't we get rid of all the interstates in the city? I want to say 12 years ago, might have been, give or take a year or two, the very first meeting the DOT had was held down in Lafayette, at the DOT Highway Garage in Lafayette. When it was first broached about 81, having to think about replacing the bridge. Might have even been more than 12 years. And at that time, there was only two options discussed: the community grid and replacing the not replacing the viaduct. The community grid, and I forgot what the other option was. The DOT never ever wanted to replace the viaduct, and unfortunately, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, this is not fact or anything like that, I think the DOT is not interested in replacing the viaduct. So I don't know what we're going to get. I don't know what kind of studies we're going to get out of the DOT. I think they're going to be slanted. The other thing is we haven't heard from our governor, and we're not going to hear from him until after the election. After the election, you will hear him push for whatever it is that he wants, and I really don't know what he wants. I would tend to agree with Peter. I think he did the whole tunnel thing under pressure, but I don't think. And I'll tell you this: the trucking industry does not want a tunnel. We do not favor a tunnel. A tunnel restricts it. It restricts all the fuel haulers. They can't go through the tunnel, so they still have to go out and around. So a tunnel really doesn't do anything for the trucking industry. The other issue is 690 itself. I don't know how many of you travel 690 during rush hour. It's a nightmare, right?
Well, right now it is with the new bridge construction.
Yeah, but even after the bridges, I mean, before they started the bridge, it's a nightmare during rush hour traffic. What happens when we add all the traffic going to the west suburbs, that now it's going to have to come up 481 and go that way, or vice versa. So just again, I'm not here to certainly argue with Peter. I respect his presentation was very good. I just want to give you a view from somebody else's perspective. That's all. I hate to say it, it is a financial thing. It does. There is a lot of added cost. And when you hear, not Peter by any stroke of the imagination, but there's been so many people say it only adds 2 minutes or 3 minutes. It does. It only adds 2 or 3 minutes going north. It's going west where the problem is. It's the west suburbs that are, I don't want to say the suburbs because that makes it sound like I'm favoring the suburbs over the city. It's the businesses to the west of the city that are affected the most by what happens with 81. Just some things to consider.
Steve, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Now, you got your bows and arrows out, and any questions that you got? Ron?
I have a question in regard to city planning. I'm part of the Everson Museum, and we're very interested in the planning of the city and the future planning of the city. And I can only talk about cities in regard to other cities besides Syracuse. In the past, the great cities such as Paris and London, some of the European cities have tried to take out the interstates of trains and traffic, 4-wheel or 8-wheel or 18-wheel traffic out of the city because they tend to segregate the city and destroy it. And Paris has successfully done that by rerouting the trains, which were at one time the most popular way of transportation in the world, outside the city. And they also rerouted the trucks out of the city by only having limited cars and transportation through the existing viaducts that remain. The problem with expanding a transportation that is now a certain loading, for instance, so many trucks going through the city, whatever the type of truck may be, whether it's a fuel truck that may cause a calamity by tipping over the viaduct or tunnel, or another type of hazard that may go through the city, or just standard transportation. The problem is when you when the transportation of large vehicles goes through the city, the destruction remains. And just think of what happens to transportation when it enlarges. If we design this viaduct, or upper viaduct, or tunnel, for transportation 20 years from now, I can almost assure you that the transportation 20 years from now is going to be multiplied by a lot. And therefore, the difficulty, the hazards, and the destruction of the city will implode. No one is thinking about that. We're only thinking about a limited way away.
Are you saying, and you and I know, that every time a truck goes down a regular road, it destroys that road this much?
Well, that may be, but I'm talking, without the maintenance, I'm talking about the possible hazards of increasing the transportation of trucking through the city, or any kind of vehicle, destroys the city. If you limit that transportation and push it out to the surrounding areas, a viaduct around the area, the city can regenerate.
So you're saying that the sensible alternative to the destruction of the city is the community grid?
Yes.
That's what I think I'm hearing you say. You hear him say that too, Peter?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's.
And if I could just add something, I'm not opposed to interstates. You know, I use them all the time myself. You know, I'm not the kind of person that says we shouldn't have efficient transportation means. But as you know, 690, that area has a whole history. It used to be the canal, and after that, it used to be where all the trains went through. So they just built 690 as an interstate in the logical area where all those other major east-west, and I use 690 all the time. So I think it's important for us to just think of this particular change, not necessarily in the larger context of interstates versus street grid, but for the particular narrower impact in terms of the area that we've been talking about.